Hello, and thank you to the organizers for putting together this fantastic panel. Today I'll be presenting Archaeological Investigations into Islamization in Northern Madagascar, Interpretation of Finds from Kingany Site II, which is based on work completed as part of my recently successful PhD thesis. As the title implies, the focus of this presentation is on the site of Kingany, which is located in northwestern Madagascar in Boueny Bay. The site is adjacent to the present-day village of Morofenyo. Kingany is a large multi-component site composed of three locales, sites 1 through 3. Site 2, which was excavated as part of my thesis, is located predominantly on the crest of a low-rising, stabilized dune, approximately 200 meters from the present-day shoreline. There are a number of associated sites in Boueny Bay, but they were either dependent on or successors to Kingany. Work conducted prior to the excavations as part of my thesis included a reconnaissance survey in 2018. This survey saw me visiting both Antishwarpur and Kingany, when both sites were rich in surface artifacts and Islamic architecture. However, Kingany was the older of the two according to both local oral tradition and previous archaeological inquiry, that being the 1960s excavation by Pierre Veron. So I chose Kingany as the case study for further investigation. I excavated at Kingany in 2019. This effort began with field proofing of Veron's site record using GPS and pedestrian survey. 25 sondages were excavated outside of visible stone architecture in order to examine ambient spatial utilization and test the boundaries of Site 2. These sondages would also serve as tools to compare different areas of the sites. While two larger excavations, one within the Masala of the Southern Mosque and one between the Southern Mosque and a well, were excavated in order to establish a chronological archaeological sequence at the site. Ceramics made up a vast majority of the artifacts recovered during this excavation and therefore formed the most significant portion of the data. These ceramics were produced using bonfire firing technology, evidenced by the presence of both reduced fabrics and oxidized fabrics on the same sherds. Complete vessel morphologies were inferred when possible, but nearly 75% of the total assemblage was sub-5 centimeter sherds. Bowls were the most plentiful group, and jars proved difficult to identify, but regardless, whole-mouth globular jars, which would have been utilized in the Comoran archipelago and were a key component of the Antithakala and Kingany series, were present. The Antithakala phase, which dates to the 12th to 14th centuries, was the foundational series of the site. This assemblage was chronologically sequenced and established based on its similarities to Mahilica and might evidence significant early connections between Kingany and Mahilica. The Kingany series, which dates from the 14th to 16th century, represents the final occupational phase of the site. This assemblage was produced by Veron and Henry Wright and inferred from the absence of scroffiato and Yemeni black on yellow and the presence of lung 1 celadon. Red slip ceramics were very common at Kingany, as so were triangular punctate motifs. Local ceramic forms identified at Site 2 shared characteristics with numerous East African coastal site groups. Open and wide bowls were identical to the mean of all sites, as seen here in this chart from Palowitz 2013. Globular vessels were generally absent from Site 2 due to the clarity observable from small sherds, and comparing statistics for intern bowls and neck jars reveals that the collection from Kingany falls within the range and nearly matches the mean for all sites listed as Swahili, while beaker and carinated bowl occurrences were more closely aligned with those of the Mikanidani and Lumbo groups of southern Tanzania and northern Mozambique, respectively. Local ceramic data recommends the presence of a diverse African population group at Site 2, with ties to communities from northern Mozambique to Kenya. The ceramics of Site 2, especially those of the Antithakala typology, were nearly identical to the early occupational series of Mahilica and Orodo, while arc and pressed ceramics, also found at Kingany, and red slip vessels were possibly inspired by Comorian, Dembeni, and Hanyundru series. Non-ceramic artifacts of the site, specifically chlorite schist and rock crystal, might evidence direct connections to the Malagasy Northeast and North Central Highlands, while analysis of beads from the site, specifically those Indo-Pacific and Kami-Pacific series, further show connections with contemporary Malagasy sites such as Mihilika and Vohomar, who also had those beads. Site II beads, however, also do share characteristics with the assemblages of Damoni and Sima and Neswani. Ultimately, many island Mozambique connections are represented within the archaeological assemblage of Kingany. Imports from farther afield show access to Indian Ocean networks, Southeast Asia, East Asia, the Persian Gulf, and the Hadramaut, with long-distance trade occurring between the 11th and 14th centuries, over 2/3 of which came from the 13th century. 16% of total imported ceramics at the site were of possible Yemeni origin, including water jars and incense burners. Access to trade goods was not limited to individuals residing within the stone homes of Kingany, as we found imports within the western open area, which would have been an area composed of daub and permanent structures. Imports wane at the site in the 15th century and are gone by the 16th century, with the possible exception of glass beads, seemingly corroborating the early 16th century abandonment of the site implied by Portuguese sources and local oral tradition. Looking at the site as a whole, we see no decipherable orthogonal arrangement or clearly defined roads. Even what might have been the town wall in the southern portion of the site appears to be disconnected at this point in time. From the sondages, it is evident that there were impermanent structures occupying the central, western, and eastern open areas of Site II, where there is also evidence for cottage industry, including cloth production and small-scale iron smithing. The densest stratigraphy in terms of cultural material at the site represent a time period after the construction of the southern mosque, in a period that would have been the Islamic period of the site. Immediately north of the southern mosque was utilized as a cemetery similar to contemporary East African coastal settlements. The northern mosque was built after the southern mosque, and because the northern mosque and the southern mosque have different qiblas, and some tombs are oriented to one or the other, we can work out rough architectural chronologies for the site, here represented by the earlier blue and the later red. Site utilization inferred from sondage data, we can see that a distinct group in the central open area which preferred cattle and consumed less shellfish than the other zones, but had limited access to imported luxury items, while the western open area and the sondage 23 to 25 were inhabited by a heterogeneous population which exploited a wide range of protein sources. The sondages 23 to 25 appeared to be an affluent zone, but had limited access to imported ceramics, while the western open area, which would have been within a daub and permanent structure area, contained Yemeni ceramics. The eastern open area contained primarily tortoise remains and few imported goods, with the exception of chlorite schist, in which it had many. This might represent an Austronesian zone within the site. As my thesis sought to trace the Islamization of the Mozambique Channel through material remains, it is important to know which remains might serve as positive markers to measure and compare Islamization through time. I utilized the concept of structuring principles, or those immutable elements of being Muslim in this endeavor. The most universal aspect of these are the manifestations of salat, or prayer, represented as mosques, prayer rugs, or turba. Similarly, burial tradition, i.e. resting on the right shoulder and facing towards Mecca, or diet, the presence absence of haram foodstuffs, or halal butchery practice, and Quranic or specific Arabic inscriptions are useful for identifying the presence of Islamic peoples in the past. In coastal East African contexts, the so-called markers of social Arabization are also useful, those being evidence for communal dining practices, the consumption or rice, or the absence or presence of fermentation paraphernalia. The most conspicuous evidence for Islam at Kingany was the mosques, It was determined from Test Unit 1 that the southern mosque must have been built in the early to mid 13th century. Therefore, the Muslim tombs oriented accordingly must have been built after. The northern mosque and the madrasa were likely built around the same time, around the 14th century. This coincided with a pointed shift in subsistence strategy towards marine resources and agropastoralism, as well as an increase in long-distance trade connections. Both mosques were of a typical Shirazi style, in this case referring to an architectural typology which describes a set of characteristics that seemingly propagated from urban Islamic towns of the Lamu archipelago in the 11th, 13th centuries. While these mosques were of Shirazi style, the mihrabs are more consistent with a Comorian style, as they are rounded on the exterior of the buildings as opposed to square. The northern mosque was visible from the ocean and not obscured by architecture, and could, in this sense, have been purposely placed as a beacon of Islam or a marker for traveling Muslim merchants, much as has been theorized, and in a manner similar to what has been theorized for coastal East Africa. Islamization at Kingany. We find evidence for a possible pre-Islamic settlement at Kingany, contrary to oral tradition and previous habitational hypotheses for the site. And because the site contains a mosque, there must have been Islamization at some point. Data indicates Islamization at the site beginning by at least the 12th century, and Islam might have propagated to the Bueni Bay via centuries of micro-migrations from Mahilika, the Comorian archipelago, and coastal East Africa, as well as individual conversions instigated in part by the long engagement within Indian Ocean mercantile spheres. Islamization at the site at Kingany was concurrent with the construction of the oldest Malagasy mosque, that being the 12th century mosque at Mahilika, though the construction of the southern mosque at Kingany wasn't until the 13th century. Artifact analysis suggests that Kingany peaked following the construction of the southern mosque. So why is this important for the Islamization of the Mozambique Channel at large? It would appear that northwest Madagascar was the initial region of Islamization on the island, with Islamization beginning in at least the 11th / early 12th century at Mahilika. Islamization in Madagascar occurred at least a century later than in the Comorian archipelago, where at Old Sima and Damoni we have evidence of 11th century stone mosques, and on Grand Comore at Nyawami we have potentially a 9th to 11th century Muslim burial. However, the Islamization of Madagascar appears to have been earlier than most of coastal Mozambique, with the exception of Chibouin in the 9th century and potential Cephallene outposts. The complexity and/or inconvenience of currents within the Mozambique Channel, when paired with superstition and the justified hesitance to settle a massive, mostly unknown island, home to potentially hostile groups, could have contributed to the relatively late presence and restriction of Islam to the coast of Madagascar. However, Muslim merchant trade preferences clearly dictated early exposure to Islam in the Mozambique Channel, though we cannot confuse trade with Islamic regions and as Islamization. The architectural and archaeological record of Kingany clearly shows that the southward expanding Shirazi phenomena reached northwest Madagascar around the same time that Islam arrived, if not only slightly later. Early Malagasy Islam, therefore, shares close connections to Comorian and Swahili variants, much as is the case in northwest Madagascar today. I'd like to thank the British Institute in East Africa, the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, my supervisors, Professor Timothy Insel, Dr. John Cooper, and Dr. Emi Selov of the University of Exeter, my beautiful wife, Kasha Anderson. I'd like to thank my Malagasy collaborators, Dr. Chantal Redmalehi, Ms. Baku, Mr. Lucien, Mr. Narendra, and the community of Morfeño. Here are the references I used for the production of this presentation. And I want to thank you for listening, and I look forward to answering any questions you might have. Thank you.